Thank you for having me here. It's the first time I'm in this building. I've been living in London for about 15 years, so I'm really happy to be here and discover this new place. And thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm usually a bit academic when I talk about these things, but I'll try not to bore you too much. So my focus today will be on how cultural diplomacy can be used in order to navigate the unstable and very conflictual world that we're living in now. So in the last 5 years, we've seen this world where geopolitics becoming one of the key ways in which we describe what's happening around the world. So there's conflict arising in different areas, like obviously Palestine, Ukraine. There's further escalation on the horizon, and who knows what will happen in the next few years. So my starting point is actually we're all experiencing the rise of geopolitics, the rise of disorder and conflict in the world because diplomacy has largely failed. And it has failed in 3 dimensions. First one is the fact that it hasn't been able to foster dialogue. And by dialogue, I mean significant and authentic engagement between different societies, between different states. It hasn't been able to encourage understanding of difference, and it hasn't been able to put at the same table societies and states who share different interests, different views of the world in order to identify common solutions to shared global problems. So my task here is to understand, well, where does cultural diplomacy fit into all of this? Can cultural diplomacy help in some way rectify all of these issues where diplomacy with a capital D has failed and has led us to this path of conflict in different parts of the world? So let's say, if we look at academic debates, cultural diplomacy as a term is highly debated. No one really knows exactly where cultural diplomacy starts and where it finishes. There are obviously different types of diplomacy, and I'm sure you've discussed throughout these days what is the difference between public diplomacy, for example, and cultural diplomacy. I'll just give you my brief understanding. I think cultural diplomacy is primarily about making a connection between different societies and helping them understand what are their differences and fostering a sense of respect among societies for their differences. So it's more about bringing together individuals and groups rather than the state level. But that's my understanding as well. But one of the key challenges for cultural diplomacy is how, through all of the activities that people engaged in cultural diplomacy do, how do they change state behavior? How can they affect these big questions of conflict? And let me refer now to the 3 aspects where I said that diplomacy with a capital D has failed. So the first one is dialogue, and we see that dialogue as a whole around the world is actually depreciating. There's less willingness, especially in the Western world, for people to accept different ideas, for people to engage in authentic debates. At the international level, we see less willingness for actually states and societies speaking to each other, and in this kind of discursive engagement, changing their own points of view. Actually, dialogue in diplomacy has become more of a monologue, where you see representatives of countries, states, actually societies, basically presenting their own points of view without in any way changing their positions through listening to other countries. And listening is another important aspect here, where diplomacy should be about listening and trying to decipher what are the needs, the views, and the interests of other societies and countries around the world. So in terms of geopolitics and conflicts, if we take, for example, Ukraine or Palestine, we see primarily diplomats and those engaged in diplomacy primarily talking to themselves, talking to their own audience, rather than trying to significantly engage through dialogue with their counterparts. And this may come from a cultural perspective, from a sort of discriminatory practice where some states diplomats pertaining from those states see their culture as being inherently superior, even though they may not articulate that directly. So you have different ways of articulating various ideas in different languages, which when translated into English, which is obviously the language of diplomacy now, may make some diplomats or some individuals from different cultures seem as not very articulate, and that in some way leads to some form of discrimination from individuals that come, let's say, from an Anglo-Saxon background. And I'm going to get back to this on a different point. The second aspect where diplomacy has failed and cultural diplomacy has to play a significant role is fostering understanding. And this obviously requires dialogue. Without engagement, without debate, significant debate, where individuals are open to changing their ideas through interactions with other individuals, understanding cannot occur. And understanding focuses on the fact that each culture, each race, each religion is equal at the end of the day. And cultural diplomacy, through all of its activities, has at its core this idea of instilling into individuals, into societies, the principle of respect and equality for difference with other cultures and other societies. But if we look at the two conflicts that I'm going to speak a bit more about later on, it has failed, and probably in the current climate, it's very difficult to foresee how cultural diplomacy and all of the activities that diplomats engaged in this area can really make a difference. But understanding through cultural diplomacy opens the way for us to learn about each other, for societies to learn about each other and see that the day-to-day life, the problems and the challenges that people share and societies share are very similar. And that, in a way, can lead individuals to focus more on cooperation rather than conflict. And the third aspect here, which is very linked to dialogue and understanding, is the fact that, especially when it comes to geopolitical challenges, it has been very difficult at the global level for diplomacy to encourage states and societies to identify shared global challenges and to come together and solve them. Rather, it has been used as a divisive tool, where we're seeing the world increasingly polarized between the West and the non-Western world. Within those two blocks, I think, especially within the West, there's more and more cohesion in seeing what the non-Western world is doing as a challenge. And in both of these conflicts, the war in Ukraine and in Palestine, actually the two sides involved see each other as their most important challenge. And another aspect that's important in terms of cultural diplomacy and making states and societies understand their shared challenges is how culture influences how diplomats negotiate. So we all come from different cultural backgrounds. We all have different expectations about how we engage with individuals. And there's a lot of academic research on how cultural background actually focuses on what people expect from negotiations. And some cultures, like again the Anglo-Saxon culture, tend to be more effective at convincing their counterparts of their negotiation position, while others, let's say the Japanese, they're less upfront about their own positions. And the clash between all of these cultures of negotiation can lead, in the end, if there's no understanding on both parts of their differences, can lead to a stalemate. And this is one area where cultural diplomacy can come in. And in terms of the two conflicts that I mentioned, these are two conflicts that have culture at the center. So if we take the conflict in Ukraine, cultural self-determination is one of the key drivers primarily for Ukraine's broader goal of separating itself both culturally and territorially from Russia, but also Russia in terms of defining in the last 30 years how it should behave, what kind of identity it should have after the fall of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, culturally, they've chosen two different paths that actually negate each other. And the war in this way is a result of the fact that their cultural constructs, the way they see themselves culturally, the way they imagine themselves, have in the last 20 years increasingly mutually excluded each other. And it's very difficult for them, for diplomats on both sides, to come together and have a significant dialogue because their positions are very much diametrically opposed. And these dilemmas about how they should position themselves culturally have two different answers in Russia and in Ukraine. So Ukraine has, I think, overwhelmingly sought to align itself with a more Western understanding of, in terms of values, in terms of ideas, while Russia is trying to position itself as a hybrid conservative actor in the world where it promotes stability, order, what they call the traditional family. Ultimately, however, in reality, the cultural differences between these two countries are insignificant if we look at the world as a whole. And that's one of the key issues that's leading to this conflict being quite bloody, I would say, and leaving aside, creating a large number of casualties, because in many societies, there's a saying that conflicts that take place within a family are much more ruthless than conflicts between strangers. And this is especially what's happening now, where you have two societies that share quite a lot of cultural aspects, who at least one of them wants to completely divorce and find another path. In Palestine, we have a similar way of culture dividing two states, two societies, but in a much more extreme way, where both societies, due to cultural reasons, seek, I would say, even to negate the existence of each other. And both in Ukraine and in Palestine, cultural diplomacy, unfortunately, has been used to deepen conflict rather than solve it. So we see on both sides cultural aspects and activities in cultural diplomacy being used in order to gain more international attention to their cause. So Ukraine has probably been the most successful case we've seen in the last 30 years of drawing attention to a specific cultural cause. But also in Palestine and Israel, we see cultural diplomacy being used not in order to bring together the two sides, but actually to get international support for one side in order to, let's say, damage the other side. And I have 5 minutes. So unfortunately, there's no space for dialogue in both conflicts. And the mainstream media around the world plays a key role in undermining the quality of dialogue in the world. We rarely see more neutral opinions coming across. There's a proclivity now for having extreme radical and normative views on all of these topics. So you're either with Russia or Ukraine, or you're either with Israel and Palestine. And all of these patterns of seeing culture as mutually exclusive will probably play out in other parts of the world as well. Think about Southeast Asia. You have the militarization of Japan now, which will probably spark in the next few years some sort of conflictual engagement with China. Who knows what will happen in Taiwan as well. India and Pakistan have had their own cultural issues for many years as well. In terms of understanding, unfortunately, cultural diplomacy can do very little at this point to enhance understanding, because in both of these conflicts and in the other areas around the world I mentioned, there is very little common ground between the sides involved. And there's very little willingness for engaging in processes of understanding. The focus is actually on how the other is different and how it is actually evil. If you look at mainstream media, you'll always see that, in this country, if you look at the BBC, Russia is always portrayed as evil. I think the conflict between Israel and Palestine is a bit more nuanced in the West, but if you look at other parts of the world, it's a bit more clear in terms of who is evil and who is good. And the third dimension I mentioned of focusing on shared challenges, global issues that required shared solutions. In terms of these geopolitical conflicts, the problem is that each side views the other as their main challenge. So there's no way to cooperate until the other side submits in some way. And again, I'm not sure how in this current climate cultural diplomacy can do something meaningful. But I would end on this. It is up to individuals to engage in forms of cultural diplomacy, be it sport, art, academia, scientific diplomacy. If we have time, I can tell you a brief story from my own past. I've tried to do this. But you need to be courageous in this because if you're always going to be criticized, and any attempt for a more neutral dialogue, for a dialogue that has empathy for both sides is very often shut down by mainstream voices. And if we think about the beginning of 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, in many Western countries there was a lot of backlash against Russian citizens. I think in this country, Russian literature and Russian opera was banned for a period as well, in sports as well. Even now, we see Russian athletes being banned. So cultural diplomacy in some way is used by states as a way of highlighting their own interest and pushing even further their adversaries in the way they see their adversaries. So I'm sorry that I don't have a more optimistic view here, but opening up the discussion, I think, is a way to start.
Thank you very much. Can we have a big round of applause? Thank you. You have heard from the first speaker that in order to be cultural diplomats, you need to be courageous. So I'm thanking Mark Donfried and the Institute of the Cultural Diplomacy for giving us this platform so that we are informed as to what cultural diplomacy is and how we can go forward. I understand that you're all courageous here, aren't you? Aren't you? Okay, so please, can we have questions and answers? Yes? For Dr. Nitoiu. Any questions? Thank you. Would you mind introducing yourself and, yes? Thank you.
Hi. My name is Martin Wayman. I'm director of the All Face Network. I think what we don't dig into enough is what are the real reasons behind the conflicts. We have the surface conflict, which is apparent that, let's take, the Gaza situation. It's apparent that, there is somebody created, in the first place, well, it's been going on for a long time, but in more recent times, there was the explosion and attack on the Jews, and then there was the counterattack and so on. But I am sure behind all of this, there is a much more, there's a much deeper reason which is not really being exposed, and to dig into these areas more, to find out which are the parties, whether they be, I'm not saying they are, I'm just saying, is it the arms industry? Is it, all of these are potential things which need, if we're dug out some more, would expose those causes. So I'm really, my question is, what role and what is the role of a cultural diplomat in this case for having a more in-depth investigative arm? That would be.
Well, I think that's a difficult question. I don't think I can answer. But I think in terms of identifying broader causes and more hidden causes, I think you're right. There are a wide range of interests that are involved in this conflict. Some of them want to see conflicts go on because there's profit, as you mentioned, military industry, for example. But I think if you think about wars in general, they're not fought by a small number of individuals. You need the buy-in from society at large. And that means that there are some cultural lingering issues within society, some tensions that are unresolved throughout history or throughout various periods of time. And what cultural diplomats can do is to try to alleviate and discuss those tensions. What people who are interested in profiting from conflict do is that they polarize societies along those differences. They use those tensions in order to gain support for their own interests and actions. And that's what's happening now. They drum up differences between Israelis and Palestinians or between Ukrainians and Russians. They portray the other as evil. But we had throughout history many examples where these long-term historical tensions and conflicts have been solved. Think about the state of Belgium, where you have two different societies that live together, but throughout centuries have fought as well on both on ethnic and religious terms. So this can happen. Even the Chinese state is an example of ethnicities fighting throughout the centuries, but coming together. But it's mostly about who has the power to actually use those tensions in a good way or in a more nefarious way.
Thank you. Does that answer your question?
In part.
In part. Thank you. Dr. Nitoiu, you're going to be here for a little while?
Yes,
so
I'm going to stay.
You can have a private conversation. Sorry, Sheikh Ramzi, sorry. What did you say?
I would like to ask a question from the professor. As a doctor of the, yes, okay. Thank you. Because he's very intelligent. Can you hear me? Yeah. As a lecturer of the Oxford University, I'm one of the lecturers of Oxford University, to the lecturer of the Loughborough. Now, how we can entangle the cultural diplomacy to the modern slavery, including the sex, you name it, child sex, child soldier, child work, or so on, so on, so on. And of course, the world at the moment we are, as we know, or as I know it, and if you can Google it, it's got 20 million people a year been missing. 20 million people. And it is a slavery is the biggest, one of the biggest business with a 350 billion pound a year. This country, United Kingdom, has more slavery, if you Google it, you will find, than 300 years ago. Of course, it's a different kind of slavery. Can we solve the problem of slavery by cultural diplomacy?
Thank you for your question. I think, as with the previous question, this is a very big question. I don't think I have a complete answer. But if I just focus on the idea of war and conflict, and because during wars, as I discussed the two wars now, wars leave various individuals extremely vulnerable. And I presume that there is quite significant trafficking happening, especially from Ukraine, because you have a lot of individuals who have been displaced. They have, well, probably in Palestine as well, but I know a bit about Ukraine. Yes, and that was a country that was already plagued by human trafficking as well. So one way in which cultural diplomacy can help is to actually shed more light on all of these aspects, either through art, for example. So my university is located in East London on the former Olympic campus, and there's a huge street with a lot of street art that's focusing on the plight of normal Palestinian people in Gaza. And some of them focus particularly on kidnappings as well. So this is one way, I think, in which regular individuals can engage in cultural diplomacy, but basically highlighting what are the cultural roots that make some individuals more vulnerable, particularly in situations of conflict, is probably the most important way in which cultural diplomacy can help. And then you can have all of the activities, cultural, artistic activities, academics engaging in all of this, having academic conferences, and I know there are quite a lot of academic conferences as well in sports. This is another aspect that can help here. And unfortunately, I don't think the Olympics was a good platform for this, but especially the Palestinians and the Ukrainians some of the athletes there have done quite interesting activities in terms of raising awareness. But I wouldn't say that human trafficking is probably one of the key priorities in cultural diplomacy. But yeah, maybe you can help making it. So.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Mark?
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in as well from your question and also from your reflections. I'll give a lecture later in the day on the future trends of culture diplomacy, the direction I think it's going in. And I think my hope for culture diplomacy is that it will actually take the model of culture diplomacy and turn itself on its head. What I mean by that, I referred to this yesterday. The foreign minister of Mozambique once said, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. Well, the most important thing for diplomacy is listening rather than speaking. I think the same is true for culture diplomacy. What do I mean by that specifically? I'll give you an example also later today. Why was the world surprised by the Arab Spring? I would argue one reason, we were doing the wrong culture diplomacy. We were busy speaking. The Americans were sending American movies, sending American music, etc. We weren't looking at Egyptian films. We weren't looking at Tunisian films. We weren't listening to Egyptian hip-hop. We weren't listening to Tunisian hip-hop. We were sending tweets. We were writing on Facebook pages. We weren't reading tweets. We weren't checking out, what's going on other Facebook pages. Can we trust everything in the social media? No. Can we trust the official media? Also no. So I think that's the job of culture diplomacy. First of all, more listening. And as you were saying as well, give voices to some voices that are sometimes not heard. And I think that form of culture diplomacy will give also more empowerment to local communities. And it's an easier way to build trust. If I come to your country and I just start speaking and telling you how great I am and telling you about my culture, that's fine. I can do that as classical culture diplomacy has done for a long time. But is it going to help for us to build trust or understanding? No. Whereas if I come to your country and first I listen, first, I get to know your country. Maybe I even empower your artists. Maybe I even create a platform where your artists can also perform. In the case of Morocco, actually, there was an interesting experiment. I Love Hip Hop in Morocco, one of the first major hip hop festivals in Morocco. It was the US Embassy and MTV. Their job there wasn't bringing American hip hop to Morocco, but putting a platform there for the Moroccan artists. Hip hop had been for a long time in Morocco, but it was very difficult for them to get the logistics and the financing and the stage. So just as one example, so hopefully I've whet your appetites for the lecture later today, but I definitely think culture diplomacy can help when it comes to human trafficking, other human rights violations, injustices around the world, raising awareness, and in doing so, maybe also making contributions to make voices heard that sometimes aren't heard by raising awareness. And at the same time, what's excellent about that, you're building trust and actually accomplishing what I think is the main goal of culture diplomacy. So you can sometimes feed 2 birds with one seed, and this would be one example. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Have you revealed your speech? So